Something I want to do a lot more of in 2024 is read challenging feminist and queer non-fiction. And this has immediately turned out to be a kind of monkey's paw situation. This is A Short History of Transmisogyny by Jules Gill Peterson, published by Verso. Jules Gill Peterson is a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, and this is a 150-ish page book that combines history, philosophy, politics, and anthropology to paint a picture of the history of transmisogyny. It's separated into an introduction, 3 detailed chapters, and a conclusion. And just like with any non-fiction that I ever read, that many of us ever read, I have filled this thing with notes and highlights. There's a lot in here that I'm probably going to read out in this review. It begins with a preface that kind of loosely defines transmisogyny. Before reading this book, I would have defined transmisogyny loosely as the patriarchal abuse of transgender women. But Jules Gill Peterson isn't really satisfied with that as a definition and goes into it in a lot more detail. So I'm going to read out just the initial paragraph of the preface. Transmisogyny refers to the targeted devaluation of both transfemininity and people perceived to be transfeminine, regardless of how they understand themselves. While it can manifest as a system of beliefs, transmisogyny also structures the material world through disparate life outcomes and a suite of characteristically punitive regimes. As an exercise of interpersonal or state violence, transmisogyny operates through the logic of the preemptive strike. It transfeminizes its targets without their assent, usually by sexualizing their presumptive femininity as if it were an expression of male aggression. That last point there sums up so much of what we sometimes call TERF or gender-critical ideology. The fundamental belief of trans-exclusionary radical feminists who tragically are often women who awkwardly call themselves feminists. Oh my god, I lost my train of thought. As a transgender book critic reading this and trying to review it, it's hard not to get wound up personally, obviously, so forgive me for that. But the transphobic women of today, the TERFs of our world, often classify transgender women as men dressed as women, and classify men as inherently dangerous and violent things that want to do nothing but abuse women. There is so much wrong with this ideology. And unfortunately, Jules Gill Peterson doesn't really offer any kind of counter-argument or solution. In the preface, the introduction, and the conclusion, she talks time and again about the gender-critical ideology, about modern-day transphobia and transmisogyny specifically, but it only served to wind me up. And that's why I said at the beginning that this is kind of a monkey's paw. I was just so wound up by things I already know. In the introduction, she offers a few really graphic and horrible accounts of hate crimes committed by transmisogynists. One being a white teenage boy in high school a few years ago, I think 2015, who shot a black trans girl at point blank range in the head because she asked him to prom. I didn't know that story, and it was a bummer. And there are a few more like it. So the preface, the introduction, and the conclusion just reiterate how awful transmisogyny is, and how tragic it all is, and how abusive it is, and how trans women are all fucked by it. And I felt sad, and I was grinding my teeth as I was reading it. The preface, the introduction, and the conclusion are also written in what people sometimes call academese, academic language. As you might have noticed from the bit that I read out, those 3 sections of this book, which are not the main bulk of it, are written in incredibly academic language. And even though I am a transgender YouTuber who reads a lot, I'm not Abigail Thorne. I do not have a background in philosophy, and even a background in reading a lot of academic texts. So honestly, half of this went over my head because of the language that Gill Peterson chooses to write with. There is so much heavy academic language in the bookends of this book. Where it begins and where it ends. There is so much dense academic language that did not need to be used. There is no justifiable reason to confuse me while also making me angry and sad and then giving me nothing to do with that anger and sadness. So This very, very good book is bookended by misery, written in a very convoluted way that made me feel stupid. Not a great start, or a great end. But in the middle, we get a lot of very, very valuable stuff. The core of this thing is 3 really, really valuable, incredibly well-researched chapters. The first is broadly about colonialism, the origins of transmisogyny. Because that's what Gil Peterson is doing with this book, is asking us, where did transmisogyny begin? What are its sources? Why does it exist in the form it takes today? And it all begins with colonialism. And it's really, really interesting. The second chapter broadly talks about the relationship between trans women and the queer community at large, and sex work in particular. And the third chapter goes into queer underground art. It talks about Stonewall, and it talks about drag queens, and this fascinating relationship between drag, being transgender, and being queer at large, and how the language over time has evolved. Marsha P. Johnson called herself gay, also called herself a transvestite, also called herself a drag queen. Trans language has evolved over time and it didn't always fit people, and that's something that this book talks about a lot, is the idea that transmisogyny is often targeted at people that the misogynists define as trans and aren't necessarily trans, don't necessarily identify with that label. And here we go back to the first chapter, colonialism. It talks a lot about the British control and colonization of India in the 19th century, and the fact that there were subgroups of people that the British defined using their own language and called sinful and monstrous and blah 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 and outlawed and were violent towards. In this first chapter, it begins with talking about a group of people called Hijra. And a loose definition of Hijra are people who were born male and present as feminine and serve a kind of ascetic purpose within their community. The closest thing that the British colonizers had to that is a eunuch, but Hijra are not eunuchs. Even if they are often castrated in their early years, they are still not eunuchs in the Western definition sense. They are their own thing, but the British colonizers didn't like that. One of the features of trans panic and transmisogyny more broadly is that it marks populations as transfeminine, or it transfeminizes them in spite of however they understand themselves. It takes away the agency of these people, it makes assumptions about them, it marks them as dangerous or strange or alien, something that shouldn't exist and something that should be dealt with by the patriarchy, by the colonizers, by the dominant white male people. And that mention there about trans panic also comes up a lot. In that tragic story I told you in the introduction about the white boy who killed the black trans girl, he went away for second-degree murder because of the trans panic argument, which has since been outlawed. This happened in California and it was outlawed before that, but people still find ways to use it as a defense. Gay panic or trans panic are things that I understood, but I'd never seen so many blatant examples of. If you don't know what they are kind of defenses made by the majority, men, white people, cisgender people, in defense of their aggressive actions. And this is a thing that winds me up, and it's such a fascinating thing because violence perpetrated towards queer people at large, and especially trans people, is constant, and yet their defense is often that we are the violent ones, and that is trans panic. This boy shot his classmate because he felt threatened by her transgender identity. He felt as though he was going to be sexually abused by her. He saw her as a gay boy who wanted to sexually assault him, and so he killed her. And so his aggressively violent and deadly actions are justified by his perception of her violent actions that did not exist. That's trans panic, and it comes up a lot in this book, and it is deafeningly depressing. Returning to colonialism for a sec, there's this brilliant bit here that says, sexual immorality was crucially interpreted as a political threat to colonial rule. As Hinchy explains, what the British didn't know drove the Hijra panic. Precisely because the British did not understand what it means to be a Hijra, they invented a story they could understand and that served imperial interests. The idea that Hijras were male prostitutes with a secret government became the pretext for a statewide campaign to secure moral order by exterminating them. This is what I loved in particular about the book, is exploring the origins of transmisogyny. It doesn't just talk about the British in India, but it also talks about American extermination of indigenous people in North America, and the policing of them, and the alienating of traditions and groups of people like the Two-Spirit. Colonialism is to blame. And colonialism is to blame for almost everything, but it's amazing to read such a well-researched book that talks about colonialism from the perspective of transmisogyny and transphobia. And then I'm just going to read a short section from the conclusion to get an idea of what she does with regards to modern-day transphobia. Many of the key achievements of liberal feminism, particularly in the West, have relied on minimizing, if not rejecting or trying to transcend femininity. To achieve equality with men, liberal feminism has often claimed that women are the same as men, downplaying their femininity to adapt to the default masculine model of authority and respect. The respectability strategy sacrifices femininity to curry favour with dominant misogynist ideas of power. Whether or not it succeeds in any of its goals, it always extends the devaluation and hatred of femininity. In that way, it always loses. This is the problem with liberal feminism and trans-exclusionary radical feminism. The hatred of femininity, the hatred of women, the need to live up to masculine standards, for women to be on par with men rather than celebrating womanhood and femininity. And that's what the conclusion kind of leans towards, the idea that good feminism isn't about trying to be equal to men, but rather celebrating womanhood in and of itself. I agree with that. I think it's great. It doesn't offer any kind of a solution to transmisogyny, but I do like it as a philosophy and I agree with it. Overall, this is a frustrating book in a lot of ways because it's written in so much academic language that becomes murky. It also just upset me as a trans person, but the core of it, the history, all of the lessons that you can learn from this and the amount of research that she did in it is incredible. This is a worthwhile read. I don't know if I've sold it as that and made that clear, but it is. It is an important book that highlights the origins and the story of transmisogyny over the past 200 years, mostly in the Western world. But if you're trans, it'll upset you. It'll wind you up. And it didn't really feel like fuel for my fire. It just kind of made me feel deflated in moments, but it's still worth it. Check it out and subscribe for books.